All right, so we're going to cover Louis XIV. He's going to be the example I want you to refer to and think about automatically when we bring up absolute monarchs. Okay, he's that perfect example because in AP Euro, in European history, there is no better individual that we can point to and say how he was able to have absolute control over his country. In this lecture, with all the information, you want to look at how did Louis XIV impact the bureaucracy, okay, government institutions, how is the government being run, how did he as a monarch impact the nobility, it's going to be a big one talked about in class, right? How did he impact the peasants, the peasantry, how did he impact economics and religion? So basically when you look at, when you look at the handouts from the notes, you're seeing once again the themes of AP Euro, and with all the different historical themes, you got to say, hey, I recognize Louis XIV is able to impact, influence the country, um, having absolute rule over all these areas, and this is kind of the result and the effect of it. Okay, all right, so let's jump into early on. He became king at 5 years old, so he couldn't rule by himself. So you need to have someone who's going to be ruling in his place and supporting all those policies. So the regent ruler is going to be Cardinal Mazarin. He's going to be the successor to Richelieu. So you kind of think Louis XIII to Richelieu, Louis XIV to Mazarin. They were both boys, and eventually they had to become of age. Major event during the reign of Louis XIV under the control of Cardinal Mazarin is the Fronde rebellions. Okay, this was a series of rebellions by the different parlements and princes. They were able to kind of rise up and revolt against the king because they felt that the monarch had too much power. Okay, and so he didn't like Mazarin did not like the nobles, and he wanted to kind of get back and take back the power for the monarchy. Okay, so the first revolt is going to happen in 1648 to 1649, and what you're going to see is a couple of different things. Well, first you have the nobles of the robe that are going to be leading this type of rebellion, and you have lawyers and administrators that are the ones orchestrating this whole rebellion, and they're establishing barricades, and there's fighting in the streets, right? And so because of this is in Paris, it gets very frantic, chaotic, and Mazarin he was threatened at one point where he has to release imprisoned princes, right? And eventually Louis XIV had to go off into exile because it was too dangerous at that time, and as a young kid. So remember that, and it'll scar him a little bit, okay? Second rebellion of the Fronde is in 1650, and this is led by the different nobility, the nobility of the sword, okay? So the nobles of the sword are those that we talked about are the medieval nobles from the Middle Ages, from heritage, because they're the warrior aristocracy. They knew how to fight. That was kind of their upbringing, right? And so these guys actually competed for power amongst each other, and because they were rivaling against each other, they did not really fight against the monarchy in unity, and because of the struggle between one another, right? Mazarin was able to defeat the nobles because they're disunified, right? And so people at this point within France, not just Louis XIV, not just Mazarin, not just the nobles, not just but everyone recognized, hey, you know what? We need a strong king to make sure that there aren't these like crazy rebellions that come out again. So the lesson learned by Louis XIV was, hey, we shouldn't always approach politics and handling the nobles with such a heavy hand. Like a lot of times there's this idiom that is you should rule with a heavy hand, meaning that when you put your fist down, right, or when you strike them, right, it's very clear that you put them in their place. That was what Richelieu and Mazarin did with the intendants, right, with their way to throw them in prison, right, and basically just push down, suppress the nobility as much as possible. Louis XIV realizes that it's very dangerous for the monarchy to do this, and so it's best to then develop a more clever way to do so. We kind of talked about this in class a little bit, right? How should we treat the nobility in a way that we control them, but not always doing it with the heavy hand and basically choking them to death, suppressing them. Okay, Louis XIV will never forget the humiliation of having to leave and flee and run away, and he was determined to make something happen, right? And so, one of his most famous lines is "One king, one law, one faith," and we're going to look at each of these parts. Okay, so how could he maintain the idea of one king, right? And the power all comes to the king is obviously with divine right. So that was one value that was there. One second. Hey, what's up, bro? Um, I didn't see it yet, but I'm in the middle of a lecture, so I'll call you back. Yeah, no problem. Okay, bye. Friends, they're important. All right. So strategy. Divine right was a belief that Louis XIV held on to. Right. We talk about Bishop Bousset. Right. He was the one who generated this idea, held on to it. Strategy is one, propaganda. Okay. So putting out images in being seen of a certain political figure, political image that people can resemble and say, oh yeah, that is who the king is, right? By having being the image of an emperor, right? Having famous portraits being painted of him, that's where he was able to have others see him in a certain way that he wanted to be seen. Okay, so this is the one portrait in 1701, very famous. Okay, if you can just look at even just the fashion, the stance, okay, the wig, all that stuff. Okay, that is trying to portray him in a certain light. Okay, the second strategy was to introduce the myth of the Sun King, right? So the Sun King, that's another nickname for him, or the Grand Monarch. Okay, the Sun King is basically the sun is the source of light for the entire solar system. Everything revolves around the sun, right? And because of that, the king is the light for all his people. And so all aspects of political life, social life, cultural life, right, should revolve around this king, the Sun King. Another statement that he made that's very famous to him is "L'État c'est moi," which is "I am the state." Um, that is what he's trying to explain. He personifies France. He is France, right? He everything he does is France. So for you to question his authority, right? Not only questioning God, but then you're just a traitor, right? Because he is the state. Okay, he will be the longest um, ruling monarch in European history for 72 years. And so he's going to set the record. And because of that, through this time of 72 years of reign, right, he's able to accomplish so much, right? And so one of the main things that he wanted to tackle was that he made sure that the nobles would, right, the nobles would kind of learn that they have a place in his kingdom. They would be growing alongside his kingdom, growing alongside his authority, right? He's going to allow them to still rule at a local level in some ways, but he is not going to let the nobility influence, okay, a lot of the political decisions that he's going to make. Because before, a lot of times the nobility would try to like offset what the monarch wants to do. Okay. Also, sometimes he would consult with some of the parliaments. He did not limit many of them. So in some ways he did, but specifically the only parliament that he really had a problem with was the Parliament of Paris. That was the main um, court system in Paris that held a lot of laws that were put into effect regardless of what the monarch would say. Okay, because his ultimate goal was to anchor his rule with the idea of divine right, and of course to domesticate the nobility, keep them in their place. Through keeping them at Versailles, and ultimately to control religion as well. So, okay, one king, one law, one faith, and we'll move on to our next one law. So Louis XIV's chief ministers really came from the middle class. Okay, so you have the nobility, and we talked about the nobility of the robe. They are coming from the middle class, and it's really to keep the original aristocracy, the original nobles, out of government, out of power, and he is hiring them, right? Selling the offices to the middle class. They're going to buy it. They have money, and they feel like, oh yeah, like were just as important as the original nobility. Okay, so he would hire many different chief ministers at that point, and he's going to continue the intendant system that Richelieu began, right, to keep the nobility in check. Um, Finances are really important to a king because to make everything work, the king needs money, right? Things don't just happen because you're the king. You still have to pay people. So finance is going to be also a weak spot of the French monarchy for many centuries. We talked about how the taxation system, even under Richelieu and Louis the 13th, right, was very ineffective, and it slowly became more effective. But collecting taxes was just not very efficient sometimes, because we talked about how the money just would never trickle back up all the way completely, and so the state would always receive less than what the taxpayers would pay. Um, as far as peasants, right? How did Louis XIV control peasants? The peasantry, they compose of 95% of the population, and it's the third estate, right? It's the non-clergy, non-nobility. It's the middle class. It's the peasants. It's the urban workers. They are the ones that are unprivileged, and they have to pay the taxes. So this is 98% of the population. 95% of the population are peasants, and so he's going to dominate his control over the peasantry by instituting, once again, upholding the corvée, which is the requirement for peasants to work for several months a year for forced labor, to work on roads, building, and public projects, buildings, and that kind of stuff. Okay. As far as peasants, they're not allowed to be idle. If they are, they're going to be drafted into the military. They're going to be thrown into workhouses where they get, punished and stuff. Poorhouses, if you guys remember. Okay. And even if to the extreme, he would execute peasants. Okay. How would he actually generate revenue, profit, right? He would raise money by selling the titles to a lot of the middle class people. They're willing to buy it because they want to have a position that has a title to it, right? So having offices being sold, you can just generate just a random name. Oh, you're the minister of agricultural oversight, right? And it can just be really nothing, but you make money off of that. Mercantilism, right? That system, economic system, being tied with and associated with absolute rule, okay? And also he would devalue the currency, okay? So if you remember the old regime, it's going to be the first estate, second estate, third estate. He's going to keep that, right, amongst the clergy, nobility, and everyone else. That type of political and social structure is going to remain under his decision, right? And that's how he was able to control society. Sorry, I didn't pop that one up. Ultimately, Louis XIV is actually popular. The middle and lower classes actually did okay, and okay is a very relative word. It's only in comparison to the peasant life in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, if you're a peasant, you're basically a serf, and you don't have any freedom at all, right? You're bound to the land, you're required to do so, and you don't have any freedom. And so, overall, what made people turn against Louis XIV was his decisions of participating in so many continental wars that cost so much money and losses for France that they hated him for that. Okay, but other parts, he was still respected in many ways. Propaganda and those strategies and the images really worked. Okay, gotta talk about Versailles. We touched about it in class, but Versailles is the critical point, right? Because under Louis XIV, the Palace of Versailles was the grandest and most impressive palace in all of Europe, and many other monarchs are going to be modeling their own palaces after Versailles. And so because of the scale of the place, this really reinforced that he is the most absolute ruler. I mean, like, can you, knock a guy if he has such a great grand estate? It's like, well, check me out. Like, this is my home, right? All should fear me and respect me because of this. This is my wealth in front of your face. Okay. French culture is going to continue to dominate because of the influence Versailles is known to be, and the kind of the culture that is coming out of Versailles. Okay, so French culture is going to dominate Europe. Literature, architecture, gardening, fashion, cooking, etiquette. France held the standard for all these areas. Okay, you don't even know like every single little thing. Just understand that whatever had to deal with people's lives and a little bit of leisure and culture and learning, France was on top at this point. Okay, the French language became the international language that was spoken for over 2 centuries, so 200 years. and those that were educated were usually educated in French. Okay, now remember before, back in the Middle Ages, and going into the Renaissance, the main language, though the vernacular was growing, Latin was still the main language for learning, right? That's what everything was scripted in. Okay, but France is going to be becoming the epicenter of literature and arts going up until the 20th century. Okay, so we're going to see that increase in that point. The royal court of Versailles was the physical setting where, more than any other monarch, Louis XIV is going to use to exert political control over them, right? It's what we call a pleasure prison, right? That you have these golden handcuffs on you, right? That life's so good in a sense, you get to like live it up, but at the same time, you're very much held, even like not according to your will, right? You're just there because you have to be there because the king wants you there, and so it's kind of like a good and bad thing. We talked about how it's the whole game and stuff, right? So the Versailles Palace was built outside Paris, about 12 miles. Became his permanent residence in 1682. And we talked about why would he move it? Because he hated the Fronde experience of the rebellions. He didn't like how it was overcrowded. He didn't like the possibility that mobs would come and attack him, and the poor people were just around the corner, and they look at this palace and look, right? Unbelievable. To put it to actual stats, it was an estimated cost to just maintain the palace, not even just to build it, but to maintain the Palace of Versailles, cost about 60% of all royal revenue. So all the revenues that he got, right, he's putting over half of that back into just keeping this place functioning and running, right? So it's like I said, it's like a resort to that degree, okay? It was a temple to royalty where the powerful would come, right, and they would worship him, right, honor him, and so those that wanted to find favors in offices, right, they would then kind of compete in this arena known as the Palace of Versailles, and they would kind of rival each other and compete with each other to get more power. Now, the funny thing is that Versailles actually wasn't just a home, right, but it wasn't just a place for be a pleasure prison, right? But there are many different purposes. Okay, you don't have to get all these down, but just listen and try to understand and just jot a few down. So the purposes, it's obviously the residence of the king, right? It's also a reception hall for many state affairs, banquets, meetings, that kind of thing. It was an office building for those that were part of the king's government. They would meet there too. It was home to thousands of royal officials and the aristocracy, and it became a symbol of absolutism to demonstrate his dominance and power as the Sun King, right? It was a sign for France's superiority upon the rest of Europe, right? And trying to impress other foreign powers, and other kings would come and say, "Hey, check out my palace," and then of course they look like, "Oh man, I don't have one of these," right? And so they would be very impressed and jealous because of this, right? Nobles would be required to live at Versailles for several months a year, right? And this we talked about this, allowed Louis to keep them in check by keeping their eye on them, right? He wanted to involve them in certain activities, part of daily court life, but also exclude them from actual real power. And so what would Louis keep his eyes upon, right? He wanted to watch over, right, everything: the army, the navy, finances, the courts, the church, the different cultural developments in drama, in literature, in arts. Everything the king was involved, and it revolved around him. Okay, many ceremonies were held with the king at the center, and these are just random ceremonies, right? They're very much staged. The king didn't have much privacy, but that was the point. He just wanted people to always be around him so that he could be actually around the people, right? So instead of always him spying on people himself, he just brought the people to him. And so, let's have a ceremony for the king to wake up. Let's have a ceremony for the king to say his prayers. Let's have a ceremony for the king to go to bed, for the king to go to mass, for the king to put on his shirt and his clothes. And it was so honorable, right, if you were the one to help him to do any of these things, right? And so why did they insist in doing these demeaning activities, once we talked about, right? Because they wanted to be gaining favor. They wanted to be gaining certain titles and favors, and even like possessions, even because the king would gift out things as well. The king wanted to put them all in an equal playing field, And from that point, as I mentioned before, this is his strategy. He wanted to break away from the heavy-handed politics and tactics that Cardinal Richelieu and Mazarin were using, and saying, "Hey, I'm more tricky in this sense." And people kind of saw it right from behind the scenes, but the nobility were kind of like, just following completely. All right, so the court by 1664, starting in 1664, had 600 people, but over time, from 600 people, part of court would grow to 10,000. 10,000. Okay, that's throughout his reign. So if you look at that, that's more than 10 times, right? Nearly 20 times as much. All right. So a couple more things that are part of court. There's a really rigid court etiquette. The ranking. For you to actually be important, you have to go up certain ranks, like a ladder system. And so it's very complex, it's very elaborate, and the idea of seniority was laid out at the dinner table, right? So where you sat each meal displayed your rank. The closer you are, obviously, the more important you are to the king, okay? And so that was, something that people actually wanted. They don't want to be seen down at the end, right? So you're going to do your way to work your way up. As far as entertainment, things to do, walk around the garden, as you can see, right? Go on boating trips, hunting trips, theater performances, concerts, gambling, spend the money, party on, okay? It's to keep them, at leisure, so they're not actually, kind of tampering with what the king is trying to really accomplish on a national level. As far as clothing, how do they spend their money? Okay, they're going to spend half their income on clothing and servants. Not just clothing, but servants too, right? So imagine rich families nowadays, you have one servant. Most families don't have any servants. But back then, the nobility had, on average, 11 servants. What are you going to do with 11 servants? It's like, I don't know, one to tie your shoes, one to put on your clothes, one to feed you. Like, basically, you're not even living anymore. But that was kind of the idea, right? And the dress was kind of the sacrament of status. What you would put on, that's competition too, right? And it's kind of similar to nowadays, where we see people like, oh, you wear this brand, oh, you have this watch, oh, you have this purse. Like, you must be really rich. You must be really wealthy. You're of high status, right? And so dress resemble kind of like your abilities and your wealth. Okay. Fashion magazines are going to start appearing in 1672, and the reason why is because we talked about how French culture would dictate that. And when Louis XIV started to wear wigs because he went bald, that's when everyone else would say, "Oh, wigs are in, right?" And everyone started following through. Ironically, though, it's a place of grandeur and etiquette and formalities and stuff. There are a lot of crudities that still remained, right? Spitting on the floor, right? Urinating in the stairways, being very crude in your humor, being obscene and stuff. That was kind of still part of culture then, so they're not completely like, oh, proper and stuff, okay? All right, last part. One king, one law, now one faith. Louis XIV wanted to prevent religious diversity. He wanted to prevent religious diversity because he believed that political unity can only be achieved through religious unity. Okay, he saw it as a very synonymous thing. So as you know, for the most part, the majority of people in France are Catholic. Okay, and so one of the groups are going to be the Catholic Jansenists, and this is a form of Calvinism, that part of the Catholic Church in France. The French Church, if just throw out there, they are independent from Rome. So the Roman Church has their influence, but France kind of has their own say of Catholicism there because of something that happened back then. It doesn't really matter. But the main point is that the Jesuits were influencing the Catholics in France. Okay, so the Jesuits are there, right? They have been controlling and influential since Henry IV, but now they're directly being targeted. Okay, so Jansenism, let me explain this real quick. Jansenism started in around the 1630s, and they were Catholic. They held on to being Catholic, right? But they opposed the Jesuits. As a review, Jesuits are super Catholics, right? But they are Catholics themselves, Jansenists, right? They opposed the Jesuits because they said, you know what, it's not about free will. The Jansenists believed in original sin. They believed in predestination, right? They're very much Calvinist influence, right? Predestination. And so because of that, there was that divide, and the Pope first banned Jansenist writings, and then from that point, Louis XIV began to say, you know what, we are going to start coming down on Jansenists. We're going to stop them as a group, right? And we're going to oppose them and stop them from promoting their faith. Okay, so the Jesuits are going to be influenced and used to stop the Jansenists, and then you also have the Huguenots. Remember, the Huguenots are the Protestant Calvinists in France. Okay, the Calvinists who are actually Protestant. So don't confuse them too much. But the Huguenots are Protestant. They are Calvinists. And at this point, if Louis XIV does not want religious diversity, he's going to begin converting the Huguenots. Okay, so the life for Huguenot families was going to be increasing in pressure. It's going to be unbearable. Soldiers are going to be quartered in homes so that they ensure the conversion and threatening them and pressuring them. Okay. Finally, in 1685, you have the Edict of Fontainebleau. Sorry, it's not revoked. Sorry, I had that wrong. Okay, so it's not revoked. The Edict of Fontainebleau revokes, not revoked, revokes the Edict of Nantes. Okay, the Edict of Nantes, remember, gave Huguenots the tolerance to worship freely. They are now no longer allowed to practice Calvinism. Okay, so the Huguenots are now banned from that, and so what ends up happening is major impact. 20,000 Protestants, Huguenots, who are skilled, who are wealthy, are leaving to the Netherlands, are leaving to Germany, and leaving to America because that's where they have religious freedom. And this is going to provide an economic blow, right? It's going to create a financial crisis for France because they have skills. They could contribute to the country, but now they are gone. And 200,000 of them is actually a pretty good amount.